The following was told to me by a stripper named Cameron about 8 years ago. I didn't pay her to tell me this story, and when she told me, she got massive goosebumps and started to quake and shiver. Cameron lived in an apartment complex in Portland, Oregon, at the end of a long cul-de-sac. On the left side of this street were houses and apartments, and on the right was a huge vacant lot, upon which once stood a barn and a home. It used to be a farm. Back in the days that Portland, Oregon, like most places in the U.S., was mostly farms. People lived off the land, had their own cows, chickens, pigs, potatoes, etc. Back in the day, most people were farmers and supported themselves. Anyway, she used to drive down this road with the vacant lot to her right, and she would drive down to the left around a sharp curve and down another quarter block to the circle. And next to the circle was her apartment complex. She worked as a stripper maybe 5 nights a week, sometimes 6. She was saving up for college, paying her bills. Stripping pays more than McDonald's. One night, about 3 a.m., Cameron was driving home by the vacant lot where the old house and barn once stood. She looked in her rearview mirror and noticed a man about 30-ish, with long unkept brown hair and a beard, wearing overalls, running behind her car, about 3 car lengths away. He looked extremely angry. She gasped and gave it some gas, and she looked back. He was gone. This scared her. Why was some guy in overalls running after her car in the middle of the street at 3 a.m. in the morning? Anyway, a few nights go by, and she's driving home again about 3 a.m. Passing the vacant lot, she looks in her rearview mirror, and it's the same man running after her car. But this time he is 2 car lengths behind. She screams and floors it, and she barely makes the sharp left-hand turn. She drives into the parking lot, gets out of her car and runs to her room and locks the door. She then looks out her window at the street, fearing he's trying to find her. She sees nothing. The next day, she tells an old lady what happened, and the old lady, who lived in the apartment complex a long time, tells her that an old man used to live in the farmhouse where the vacant lot now was. The old man died, and the house and barn were torn down, burned down by the fire department. People in the area use it as a dog park. Local kids played their various army games and whatnot there. The old woman told her that the old man had a psycho son who had kidnapped and killed several women and buried their bodies under the barn. She didn't know for sure when that happened, but she suspected it was back in the early 30s. Anyway, they arrested the son and took him away to the state mental hospital, and they kept him there until he died. The father remained in the farmhouse alone until he died when he was quite old. The story scared Cameron, who decided she had to move, so she looked for a place and found one. She was working at the strip club her last night before the move. Everything was packed and she was ready to go. She dreaded the thought of having to drive by the vacant lot again. It freaked her out, but she was determined to just not look in her rearview mirror and not look behind her when she drove by. She acted as if the vacant lot didn't exist. She worked. Finally, it was her last day living at the apartment complex. It was her day off, and she decided to just finish packing and relax. Her manager called her, asking her to come in, because several girls didn't show up. She said she couldn't, but he was insistent, so she finally agreed. She got off about 2:30 a.m., changed and drove back. She dreaded driving by the vacant lot, but was happy that this was the last night she would have to do so. Tomorrow she was leaving for her new apartment. For the last week or so, every time she drove by the vacant lot, she looked straight ahead, and it worked. She approached her street. She thought, nope, not gonna look back. She started to drive down past the vacant lot. She could feel a chill down her spine. The hairs on her arms stood up. She got the overwhelming sensation that someone was staring at her. Without thinking about it, she looked in her rearview mirror, and she saw nothing. Nothing was chasing her. She was so relieved. She looked back over her right shoulder and noticed that the man in overalls was sitting in her back seat, on the right side. He was staring at her. She screamed and floored it. She didn't make the sharp turn. She hit the curb and the car catapulted into the vacant field and kept going until it ran into some thorny hedge. With the car still on, she screamed and opened her door and ran to her apartment, screaming the whole way, convinced that the man in overalls was chasing her. She screamed so loud that a few people came out of their apartments. They assured her nobody was chasing her. Several of the men went to her car, looked around and found nobody. They turned off and locked her car and gave her the keys. She didn't sleep that night, fearing the man in overalls would come to her door. He didn't. She left at first light. That is what Cameron told me. She was shaking and got huge goosebumps when she told me this story, which is why I believe her. So a couple of years back, I was staying with my mom in this fairly haunted place. It wasn't too bad, but definitely some weird shit happened while we were there. We would go ghost hunting a lot during that summer and have some interesting stuff happen, but nothing stood out quite as much as this experience. A little backstory. My mom, a good guy friend, and I had gone ghost hunting in an old abandoned house. The whole place was set up pretty weird, and we got some interesting things recorded. My mom got scratch marks on her back. Now this whole experience is a story for a different time. What's important to note is that while we were there, we had found an old tin filled with photographs, a real silver spoon, and a Victorian-style brooch. I had commented about how much I loved the brooch to my mom, but following ghost hunting common sense left it in the tin where we had found it. Fast forward a few hours later. We're now home and I'm going to shower, and in my pocket is that damn brooch. We tried everything to get rid of it, but it would always appear back in the house in the most random places. The activity in the house increased tenfold. Eventually, my mom buried the brooch outside and placed protective crystals around the outside of the house. We didn't see it again. Now it was a super dry summer, not uncommon for South Texas. So when my best friend Nala and I heard a loud thunderstorm starting outside in the middle of the night, we got super excited. Since we were home alone that night, we quickly threw on our shoes and bolted outside, dancing and laughing in the heavy rain. It was a lot of fun, till suddenly I felt pure fear start pumping through my veins. My attention immediately snapped to where the brooch was buried. At the same time, a flash of lightning lit up the whole yard. I mean, it looked like daylight outside for those few seconds. Standing there, I saw a thick, black shadow man with what looked like a top hat. It's so hard to explain the exact feeling, but I knew I had to get inside that very moment. I immediately started running for the front door. I vaguely heard Nala running very close on my heels. We were struggling to get the door open. For some reason, it would just not budge. Eventually, we both managed to do it, run inside, slam it shut, and lock it. We turned to each other and at the same time spoke.
Did you hear that?
Did you see that?
Both confused and a little terrified, we explained what we had both meant. I told Nala about how I saw the shadow man. She had not seen him. Instead, she had heard, at the same time I saw the man, a loud, inhuman growl right next to her ear. Keep in mind, I hadn't heard anything, and the thunder for the lightning strike had sounded while we were running back to the house. This was not my worst experience, but definitely in the top 3. I will never forget that raw fear I felt, nor can I ever fully explain it. It was like my life was in danger. The summer of 2008, I had the opportunity to go to a small community in Nicaragua for a week-long mission trip. There were 30 or so members in this group. However, I only knew 2 people, a young couple from my home church. I was 16 years old at the time, and it was my first time going to another country without any of my family there with me. So I was both proud to feel like an adult and scared shitless having to be an adult. I'd been to Eastern Europe the year before on a smaller mission, so I went into this trip with the same expectations. Those expectations quickly changed on the 2-hour bus ride from the airport to where we were staying. The highway was poorly paved, when there was pavement to speak of. The cities and towns were filled with dilapidated huts and businesses, and malnourished livestock and dogs roamed the streets. It truly was another world. Once at the mission house, we unpacked our belongings and gathered in the main room for a meet and greet and briefing. Among the 30 people there were several pastors, a few interpreters, and a very cute girl who was several years older than me. Despite being somewhat distracted by my newfound mission crush, I specifically remember the warnings we received about the area. We were told the communities we would be in were full of gang activity, and to always stay in groups of no less than 3 in certain areas. As if that weren't enough to worry me, we were told that black magic and witchcraft were common practice, and practitioners were known to put curses on people they felt were opposing their beliefs. Needless to say, being part of a Christian mission on their turf did not bring me any comfort. The week went surprisingly smooth, and was filled with awesome people and amazing experiences. But the whole time there was what felt to be, for lack of better terms, a darkness that followed the group. No matter where we were or what we were doing, there was an unexplained feeling of there being something wrong. Every member of the group whom I spoke with about the matter said they felt the same thing. Close to the end of the week, I feel like we found where the darkness lived. The weather had turned bad that morning, as a small group of us loaded up the bus and started down the road. Hurricane Alma would make landfall the next day. We weren't told where we were going, only that we were going to hand out food to some locals. We turned off of the main highway and down a rutted dirt road, which wound between seemingly abandoned buildings. With each turn we made, more and more garbage appeared on the side of the road, until it was apparent we were entering a landfill. The bus came to a stop when hills of trash became visible. I remember thinking to myself, there's absolutely no way anyone could live here. Almost as an answer to my thoughts, pieces of cardboard began to move as people began emerging from garbage shelters and walking towards where we were parked. By this time, the rain had turned into a downpour, and the ruts of the road were now muddy streams emptying into the landfill. The sadness I felt for these people turned into heartbreak when I saw a small girl being led by a young woman in the group. The food truck pulled up behind our bus, and we all stood to exit, when the group leader deemed it too wet for us to get out and help hand out the food. Myself and several others protested, but were ultimately overruled. I know it's cheesy to say, but to this day, I still feel the sadness and anger I felt seeing those people watch as our bus turned around and drove away. The next night was our last in the area, and we held an assembly for the community at a local baseball stadium. The rain had broke an hour before it started, and several hundred locals filled the stands as the service began. The rain had shorted out the sound system, so the preacher stood atop the bus, which had been pulled onto the pitcher's mound, and shared a megaphone with the interpreter for the duration of his message. Afterwards, he invited everyone onto the field to speak with us. To our surprise, nearly everyone in the stands came center field, all seemingly eager to talk to us. A middle-aged woman introduced me to her daughter and encouraged her to practice her English with me. Several minutes into our conversation, we were interrupted by a member of our group. He grabbed me by the shoulder. With an unsettling urgency in his voice, he said they needed my help and quickly walked through the crowd in the direction of third base. I excused myself from the conversation and began to follow, when I noticed large numbers of people quickly moving away from the direction we were going. As I cleared through the crowd, I saw nearly all of the men in our group holding someone to the ground. Thinking something terrible had happened, I ran towards the pile. As I approached, the man who had asked for my help told me to cross the person's ankles and hold them down. Hesitantly, I did so. The person was screaming at the top of their lungs and kicking their legs with what seemed to be superhuman strength. I looked towards the person's face, and to this day, I wish I hadn't. The subject of the commotion was a young local man who was of a wiry build. He was wearing dirty clothes and stank to high heaven. His face was contorted to the point of seeming inhuman, and his mouth was opened so wide it was almost as if his jaw had come unhinged. His eyes were rolled into the back of his head, and his head whipped side to side as he screamed. The men closest to his head were holding his arms out to the sides, and the rest of the group formed a semicircle behind them, and were all praying aloud. I then realized we were holding this man in the form of a crucifix, and I suddenly put two and two together. Paralyzed with fear, I held the man's ankles as tight as I could, and stared at his face as the group was commanding a demon to exit his body in the name of Jesus. I wanted to let go and get as far away from the situation as I could, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The man suddenly stopped fighting and began slowly moving his head back and forth. A lady in our group, who I found out later had written a book on demonology, demanded the demon tell her his name. The man stopped moving and took a deep breath.
"We are rage!"
He screamed the name so loud that it hurt my ears. The voice was, for lack of a better word, demonic, and sounded like two people speaking at once. The woman, who had at first seemed unshaken, showed concern and told us to let him go. How I've described what happened next is a little odd, but it's been the best analogy that I've been able to think of. If you've ever seen a spider die, sprayed with poison or stepped on, you've seen how its legs curl and form somewhat of a ball. As if his arms and legs were spring-loaded, they snapped hard to his body, and he curled up into a ball and began writhing around on the grass. We all backed up, and the praying stopped, except for my mission crush who was standing apart from the group, crying and praying aloud. The man went limp face down on the ground, with his head pointed towards the girl. Her praying became more intense as she cried harder, when the man, without lifting his head, began pulling himself along the grass towards her with only his arms. She slowly backed away while continuing to pray, as the man slowly drug his body towards her. Anger suddenly washed over me, and I started to run towards him with the intent of kicking him in the head, but was stopped by two of the men in the group. The girl stopped praying, and the man went limp for the last time. An ambulance had apparently been called, and the crew rushed onto the field with a stretcher and loaded up the unconscious man. It was then that I realized I had seen him the day before at the landfill. He was one of the people who had emerged from the trash shelters and watched as we drove away. Once the incident was over, we loaded onto the bus and started back to the mission house. The woman who had asked for the demon's name came and sat beside me and tried to explain what we had just witnessed. Long story short, there was supposedly a legion of demons inside the man, and it was unsafe for us to challenge them. The preacher who the man had initially approached said the man did not speak English and fell to the ground in convulsions as soon as he laid his hand on his shoulder. I'm not the most spiritual or religious person, and I try to consider things logically before making assumptions of supernatural interference. I considered that the man was simply having a seizure, but after witnessing multiple seizure victims afterwards, it did not match up. Some sort of neurological disorder or psychosis may explain parts of the man's behavior, but I have not been able to say that's what it was for certain. Demon or not, this was a very unique and terrifying experience. I'm a 26-year-old female. In 2014, I briefly dated a really bad guy. I'm talking physically and emotionally abusive. Been divorced 4 times. Completely abandoned his kids. Severe PTSD. You get the idea. Anyways, before I had realized what kind of guy he really was, I had decided to go out drinking one evening with him and some coworkers. He got absolutely hammered and I had a few beers. I was a heavy drinker then, so this wasn't enough for me to be anywhere near drunk, but I won't drink any amount and drive. So a friend dropped us both off at his house because my car was there, and I had decided to stay over to keep an eye on him, and because I was not going to drive myself home. I helped him inside and straight to bed, where he almost immediately passed out. I decided to go ahead and lay down as well, since it was almost 3 a.m. at this point, but couldn't shake this weird foreboding feeling once I was settled in. I was laying there awake, contemplating if I should call a taxi or just wait a little while and drive myself home. After a few minutes had passed, I was suddenly overcome with a sense of dread. I turned to my left where the guy was to check his pulse and make sure he was breathing okay, when I noticed there was a dark figure standing over him from the side of the bed. I was absolutely paralyzed with fear. The figure wasn't totally opaque, but wasn't exactly transparent either. It was black, tall, and did not have a harsh outline or any defined features, if that makes sense. As I laid there paralyzed, mind racing, it bent down slightly and began to whisper in what sounded like Latin mixed with some other language. At this point, I began to pray out loud and say things like, "You aren't welcome here. We are protected by God. You have no power over us." And after a few minutes, the figure sneered at me, then seemed to sink down beside the bed and disappeared altogether. I was too afraid to get up and leave, so I laid there awake and terrified until morning. When the sun rose, I woke the guy up and told him what had happened. He said that he already knew because he had felt and heard the spirit in his dream, and that this was a usual occurrence for him that started when he was a child. I was genuinely afraid for him after that, but he was not worried at all about the evil spirit that seemed attached to him in some way. Then, after finding out the details about him mentioned at the beginning of this post, I did become afraid of him, because it seemed obvious to me that whatever the dark figure was, it definitely had very bad intentions and some sort of power over him. I ghosted the guy and haven't had any other weird encounters since. This is the earliest paranormal experience of mine that I can remember, and I didn't even consider it paranormal because it happened when I was so little. But after I grew up, the paranormal took a real interest in me for some reason. This happened when I was like 3 years old. I do actually have some solid memories from when I was that young. I'm not sure if that's a common thing or not, but I suspect for some people it is. My family lived out in the country in the middle of Illinois. On Sundays, an elderly couple that lived nearby would take me and my older brother and sister to church. That way they could church us up a bit and give my parents a little time off from us kids. We would go to the old couple's house after church, and the old man would tell me not to go into their bedroom because a little green monster lived in there. It was his cute little way of keeping me out of there, and then he could keep an eye on me from his recliner in the living room. Of course, I would run into the bedroom with a huge smile, laughing, as a little kid does, you know. "Ha ha, come chase after me." And one time I saw that little green monster in front of the closet with an evil grin. He had matted green hair and kind of reminded me of Oscar the Grouch, which was my only reference at the time, but he looked a lot more sinister. He was just standing there blinking at me. I froze in shock. The old man did not come get me, and as soon as I could move again, I ran out of there. The whole thing lasted maybe 10 to 15 seconds. What I think happened is an actual entity appeared as the little green monster, like a sick joke to scare the crap out of me and take advantage of the situation. I was thoroughly spooked and have never forgotten it, and I'm well aware that the logical explanation is a kid's imagination, but I tell you, it was there, three-dimensional in real life, standing across the room staring at me. I can still see that bedroom and that little green monster in my head as clear as day, and I would probably dismiss it myself, but like I said, when I got into my mid-20s or so, the supernatural shit hit the spiritual fan in my life, and to date I have experienced way more paranormal activity than any one man should have to. Also, if you're in the know about these things, these entities like to fucking scare little kids. As far as paranormal shit goes, it's quite common, and I believe that this was the first time these entities were saying hi to me, so to speak. As made clear from the title, this is not about me. It happened to my mom when she was very young. It's important to know some context beforehand. My mother grew up through a civil war in Angola before her family fled from the country, leaving everything and everyone behind. She was 9. She of course witnessed many brutal things that no child should, such as friends killed in shootings, racism, and even sexual assault by soldiers. For nonetheless becoming the accomplished and amazing woman and mother she is today, I respect and thank her greatly. Understandably, she doesn't share many stories from those times, but this is one she did, and it stuck with me. She was in class with some 20 or so kids and teacher. It's worth noting that thanks to heat and poverty, classrooms were nothing more than mud and reed walls and ceiling, but still very heavy. Well, she was paying attention in class when her sight flashed white, and she saw a sudden, very vivid vision of the ceiling collapsing. The vision ends, and she springs up from her seat and starts packing her things in a panic, on the verge of tears. Her disturbance sets up quite a commotion around her, and the teacher asks what she thinks she's doing. She simply says that the classroom is going to collapse, and everyone should leave. Nobody believes her, of course, but by now she's crying and the teacher is angry. You know how kids are. It spreads, and eventually the entire class is mildly panicked, packing their things as well. She sprints through the door and everyone follows her, the teacher close behind them. And then the ceiling collapses. The teacher, being the last to leave, actually got her leg caught in the falling ceiling and was badly injured, but apart from that, everyone was fine. My mother told her mother what had happened, and my grandma got really angry and told her not to speak of it again. She was actually quite upset upon finding that my mom had told us, her own kids, this story. Our family has a strange connection to the paranormal, even though no one wants to admit it. Now, I've never experienced something of this magnitude, but I've always had reason to believe and fear the paranormal. My sister has a much stronger bond, I suppose, and she has many more stories. I've never once doubted my mother, but in truth, she was young and troubled, and this was a long time ago, and she says nothing like it ever happened again. I actually doubt that. What could explain it? Has anything like it happened to anyone else? Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. Send your story or creepypasta to the email in the description. Check out some shirts in the description. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Corey Rhino. And be good to animals, even people. So. There comes a time in a man's life when he realizes that he needs to stand up for what he believes in, regardless of what other people think. And I have this platform to stand up for what's right. And I'm just gonna do it right now. Bring back the chili cheese burrito, Taco Bell. The fucking chilito. We want it. Meanwhile, you got all this other shit that shows up. It's the same ingredients, it's just wrapped up differently. So do it once a year. It's a pot of chili that's hot, and you put it into a tortilla with cheese, and then you give it to me, and I pay you money. What's so hard about that? And some of you assholes are lucky. They might do it at your Taco Bell, and you might not even know. You might have never had one. If we want to change the world, this is the first step. So seriously, Taco Bell, give us the damn chili cheese burrito. You pricks. Oh shit, they found me. Ripley, they found us.